The night was still, broken only by the low hum of crickets and the occasional distant bark of a dog. Officer Jack Holloway sat in his patrol car, its headlights cutting through the dense southern air. The small town of Mason's Hollow wasn't much a scatter of aging homes, a few diners clinging to their prime, and a courthouse that hadn't seen renovation since the 1950s. But to Jack it was his domain, a place where he could impose order, or at least his version of it. Jack leaned back, gripping the wheel loosely as he scanned the desolate streets. His sharp jawline caught the moonlight, and his pale blue eyes carried a coldness earned through years of upholding a deeply ingrained ideology. On the dashboard sat an old photograph of his father, clad in the crisp white robes of the Ku Klux Klan, flanked by a few other men wearing smug, triumphant grins. It was a relic of another time, but its message was timeless to Jack, a torch handed down through generations. Tonight had been quiet. Too quiet for Jack's liking. His usual rounds felt more like routines than duties. A rundown truck with an expired tag, a pair of teenagers loitering near the diner. It was the kind of night that passed without significance. But Jack wasn't looking for the mundane. He was waiting for something, anything, that would allow him to flex his authority. A faint flicker of movement caught his eye, and Jack straightened. Up ahead, a man was walking on the shoulder of the road, his figure illuminated briefly in the car's headlights. Jack slowed, his pulse quickening not from fear, but from the anticipation of action. The man was tall and well-dressed, his crisp white shirt contrasting against his dark skin. A polished leather briefcase swung at his side. Jack's lip curled slightly. What's he doing out here at this hour? He pulled to a stop, switching on the patrol car's lights. The man stopped walking and turned toward the car, his expression unreadable but calm. Jack watched him for a moment, his fingers tightening on the wheel. "Just my luck," Jack muttered under his breath. He swung the door open, his boots crunching on the gravel as he stepped out. "Evenin'," Jack said, his voice carrying a practiced authority. "What brings you out on these roads so late?" The man didn't flinch. "Good evening, officer. My car broke down about a mile back. I'm just heading to the nearest gas station." Jack eyed him critically. "This road doesn't lead to any station for miles. Got a reason for being on it." The man tilted his head slightly, his composure unshaken. "It's the quickest way to where I'm going." Jack's jaw tightened. There was something about the man's calm demeanor that irked him. People in Mason's Hollow didn't carry themselves like that, least of all the black residents who knew better than to attract attention. "ID and a registration," Jack demanded, stepping closer. The man nodded, slowly setting his briefcase down and pulling out his wallet. His movements were deliberate, almost too careful, as if he were accustomed to these interactions. He handed over his driver's license and registration without a word. Jack scrutinized the documents, his eyes narrowing. Samuel Wright. The name meant nothing to him, but the address was a different story. The man wasn't from Mason's Hollow or even the neighboring counties. He was from Atlanta, a city Jack associated with liberal nonsense and dangerous ideas. "What brings you from Atlanta to these parts?" Jack asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Business," Samuel replied simply. "Business," Jack repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Funny place for business, don't you think?" Samuel met Jack's gaze evenly. "I don't see what's funny about it." Jack's fingers twitched. He was used to seeing fear or submission in these situations, but Samuel's calmness felt almost like defiance. Jack took a step closer, using his height to loom over the man. "Mind if I check your briefcase?" Jack asked, though it was hardly a question. Samuel hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I'd prefer you didn't. There's nothing in there that concerns you." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? You don't get to decide what concerns me?" Samuel sighed, bending down to pick up the briefcase. Jack's hand shot out to stop him, gripping his arm firmly. Slowly Jack growled, his voice low. "Don't make any sudden moves." Samuel froze, then slowly straightened, raising his hands in a show of compliance. Jack reached down and snatched the briefcase, holding it as if it were a trophy. He flipped the latches open, his eyes scanning the contents: legal documents, a laptop, and a leather-bound notebook. Jack frowned. There was nothing incriminating, but he wasn't ready to let it go. He pulled out the notebook, flipping through its pages. They were filled with meticulous notes and what looked like legal jargon. Jack's scowl deepened. "What kind of business are you in?" Jack asked, his tone accusatory. "I'm a lawyer," Samuel replied evenly. Jack's eyes flicked up, searching for any sign of deceit. "Lawyer, huh? That's supposed to impress me." "It's not meant to impress or offend," Samuel said calmly. "It's just the truth." Jack didn't respond. He snapped the briefcase shut and shoved it into Samuel's chest with enough force to make him step back. "Get in the car," Jack ordered. Samuel's calm exterior cracked for the first time, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "On what grounds?" Jack smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. "Suspicious activity. I'll sort it out at the station." Samuel hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Jack thought he might resist, but then Samuel nodded and climbed into the back of the patrol car without a word. Jack slid into the driver's seat, the faint hum of satisfaction settling over him. As he drove toward the station, he glanced at Samuel in the rearview mirror. The man sat with his hands clasped in his lap, his expression calm but unreadable. "You think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" Jack said, breaking the silence. Samuel didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was measured, almost gentle. "No, officer. I think we're all human. No better, no worse." Jack's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Jack didn't know why they bothered him so much, but they did. Something about this man, his calmness, his confidence felt like a challenge, and Jack wasn't used to being challenged. As they neared the station, Jack's mind raced. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he was determined to find something, anything to justify his actions. Samuel Wright might have been calm and composed, but Jack Holloway wasn't about to let some smooth-talking city lawyer make him feel small in his own town. He tightened his grip on the wheel, his resolve hardening. Tonight he would remind Samuel and himself who held the power in Mason's Hollow. Jack Holloway leaned against the station's cold brick wall, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing in his ears like an unrelenting swarm of bees. Samuel Wright's name was still on the screen, glowing faintly in the dim room, but Jack had stepped away from it as though the information had burned him. A civil rights attorney. Not just any attorney, but one who had argued and won cases that had made national headlines. Jack clenched his fists at his sides, his knuckles white under the strain. This wasn't what he expected. He'd thought he'd be dealing with another lowlife passing through Mason's Hollow, someone easy to intimidate, easy to break. But Samuel was different, too polished, too composed. And now Jack understood why. "You all right there?" Jack Darren asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and something Jack didn't like, amusement. "Fine," Jack snapped, though the tightness in his throat betrayed him. Darren smirked. "Didn't expect that, huh? A big-shot lawyer in our little slice of nowhere. Guess he's not one of those troublemakers you always go on about." Jack shot him a glare sharp enough to cut steel. Darren put his hands up in mock surrender, but the smirk didn't fade. Jack hated the way Darren's words stuck, like a splinter under his skin. Trouble had a way of disguising itself, his father used to say. Just because a man looked polished didn't mean he wasn't hiding dirt. Jack stormed out of the room, heading back toward the small interrogation chamber where Samuel waited. His boots echoed against the tiled floor, each step heavier than the last. As he reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He felt something he hadn't expected: hesitation. Why was it there? Why did Samuel's calm demeanor and undeniable credentials make him feel like he was on trial instead? "Get it together," Jack muttered under his breath. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Samuel looked up from where he sat, his expression still calm, though his eyes betrayed a faint glimmer of curiosity. His composure irritated Jack. It felt like Samuel had already won some invisible game Jack didn't know he was playing. "Mr. Wright," Jack began, closing the door behind him. He stayed standing, looming over Samuel, trying to reassert the power he felt slipping through his fingers. "It seems you've got quite the resume. A lawyer for civil rights cases, huh? That must pay well." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "It's fulfilling work. And yes, it pays enough." Jack leaned against the table, crossing his arms. So what's someone like you doing in Mason's Hollow? Seems like you'd have better places to be. I told you, Samuel said evenly. I was on my way to a speaking engagement. My car broke down. Simple as that. Speaking engagement, Jack's voice carried a note of suspicion. Don't tell me you're here to stir up trouble. Samuel met his gaze without flinching. I'm here to speak at a community event, Officer Holloway, about justice, equality, and the importance of law in protecting those who can't protect themselves. Jack's lip curled into something between a sneer and a smirk. Sounds like trouble to me. Samuel's calm exterior cracked slightly. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. If advocating for basic human rights is trouble, then perhaps this town needs a little more of it. The words landed like a punch, and for a moment, Jack couldn't respond. They stirred something deep and uncomfortable within him, something he had spent years burying under layers of inherited hatred and blind allegiance. Watch your tone, Jack growled, more out of habit than conviction. Samuel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. No, officer. Perhaps it's time you watch yours. Jack stiffened, his pulse quickening. No one talked to him like that, at least not without consequences. But Samuel's words weren't born of fear or defiance, they carried the weight of truth. And that truth made Jack's stomach churn. You think you're better than me, don't you? Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. No, Samuel replied. But I think you're afraid of what I represent. Jack's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. And what's that supposed to mean? Samuel's gaze was steady, piercing. It means that I challenge everything you've been taught to believe. Your power, your identity, your place in this world, it all hinges on the lie that people like me are beneath you. And deep down, you know that lie can't hold forever. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, anger and confusion battling for dominance. How could this man, this stranger, see so clearly into the cracks Jack had spent a lifetime covering? You don't know anything about me, Jack spat. Samuel's expression softened, but it wasn't pity Jack saw, it was understanding. And that was somehow worse. I know enough, Samuel said. I've seen men like you before. Men trapped by the hatred they inherited, too afraid to let it go because they don't know who they'd be without it. The words struck a nerve Jack didn't even realize he had. Images from his childhood flooded his mind, his father, a towering figure of authority, teaching him to hate without question. The clan meetings in the barn, the burning crosses that were supposed to symbolize power but now felt like symbols of shame. Jack pushed the memories aside, shoving them into the darkest corners of his mind. He wouldn't let Samuel get under his skin. He couldn't. You don't know what you're talking about, Jack said, his voice unsteady. Don't I? Samuel countered. You pulled me over for walking on the wrong road at the wrong time, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I didn't fit into the world you've built for yourself. Jack turned away, pacing the small room as he tried to regain control of the situation. His thoughts were a chaotic mess, the foundation of his beliefs cracking under the weight of Samuel's words. Before Jack could respond, there was a knock at the door. Darren stuck his head in, his face unusually serious. Jack, we've got company. Jack frowned. What kind of company? Big company, Darren said, jerking his thumb toward the front of the station. Some guy from the city just rolled in. Says he's here for Samuel Wright. Looks like he means business. Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Without another word, he stepped past Darren and headed toward the front of the station. As he entered the main room, his eyes landed on a man in a sharp suit, his presence commanding attention. The man turned to Jack, his expression stern. Officer Holloway, I presume. Jack nodded, his throat dry. Who's asking? I'm Andrew Wallace, the man said, extending a business card that Jack hesitated to take. Mr. Wright's legal associate. I've been sent here to ensure his immediate release. Jack's grip tightened on the card as his mind raced. Samuel wasn't just a lawyer, he was connected to powerful people who could cause problems Jack hadn't anticipated. You can't just... Wallace cut him off with a cold smile. I can, and I will. Unless you'd like to explain to the state why you detained a prominent civil rights attorney without cause. The room felt suddenly suffocating. Jack's world was spinning out of control, and for the first time he felt the weight of the consequences he might face. He looked back toward the interrogation room, where Samuel Wright waited, calm and unshaken, the man who had begun to tear Jack's world apart. Jack Holloway's jaw tightened as he stared at the business card in his hand. The name Andrew Wallace gleamed in bold letters, along with the title Senior Legal Counsel. The air in the station felt heavier, charged with an energy Jack couldn't quite identify, something between tension and inevitability. He hadn't expected things to spiral so quickly, and the presence of Wallace only magnified the precariousness of his situation. Wallace stood with an unflinching gaze, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to the station's dingy surroundings. Jack knew men like him confident, sharp, and unwilling to compromise. He also knew Wallace was the kind of man who could turn the smallest mistake into a career-ending catastrophe. "I don't take kindly to being strong-armed," Jack muttered, his fingers crushing the edge of the business card. Wallace didn't blink. "This isn't about your feelings, Officer Holloway. It's about the law, and right now you're skating on very thin ice." The words were like a slap, but Jack refused to let it show. He straightened his posture, trying to reclaim the authority that seemed to be slipping away. "Mr. Wright is under suspicion for..." Suspicion of what? Wallace interrupted, his voice cold and cutting. "Walking while black. Let's not insult each other's intelligence, officer. We both know that's the only reason he's in that room." Jack's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind raced for a response, something that could deflect the accusation and put him back on solid ground. But Wallace's glare was unrelenting, and Jack felt the cracks in his argument widening. Before he could reply, the door to the interrogation room opened, and Samuel Wright stepped out, his briefcase in hand and his calm composure unbroken. His gaze swept across the room, landing on Wallace, who gave him a subtle nod. "Mr. Wright," Wallace said, stepping toward him, "I trust you're unharmed." Samuel's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained sharp. "Physically, yes." Jack's face flushed. He felt the weight of their words, the implicit judgment in every syllable. Samuel wasn't just a man in a suit, he was a man with allies, a man with power, and Jack had underestimated him. "This isn't over," Jack said, his voice low and defiant. He hated how small he sounded, how out of control he felt. Samuel turned to face him, his expression a mixture of weariness and resolve. "No, Officer Holloway, it isn't. But not for the reasons you think." Jack bristled. The calmness in Samuel's voice was more infuriating than outright defiance. It was as though Samuel knew something Jack didn't, something that would change the game entirely. Wallace placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. "We'll be filing a formal complaint," Wallace said, his tone matter-of-fact. "And believe me, this won't go unnoticed." Jack felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. He wanted to lash out to reclaim the upper hand, but he knew the situation had already slipped beyond his control. He could only watch as Samuel and Wallace walked out of the station, their presence leaving a lingering tension that refused to dissipate. As the door closed behind them, Darren leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "Well, that was something." Jack shot him a glare. "Shut it, Darren." But Darren wasn't done. "You really stepped in it this time, Jack. Those kinds of people don't just let things go." Jack didn't respond. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a gnawing uncertainty that he couldn't shake. He had spent his life believing in a world where power was clear-cut, where men like him were always in control. But Samuel Wright had shattered that illusion, and Jack didn't know how to put the pieces back together. He sank into his chair, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. For the first time in his life, Jack Holloway wasn't sure where he stood or who he was, and that terrified him more than anything. The night outside the Masons Hollow station had deepened, wrapping the town in a suffocating blanket of silence. Jack Holloway remained in his chair, staring blankly at the door through which Samuel Wright and Andrew Wallace had walked out. The tension in his chest had not eased. Instead, it grew heavier, suffused with an unfamiliar sense of doubt. Darren had gone back to his newspaper, though the occasional glance he threw Jack's way was heavy with unspoken commentary. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder, more oppressive. Jack felt like the walls were closing in, like the station that had once been his sanctuary was now a cage. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a flask, unscrewing the cap with shaking hands. The burn of the liquor was sharp and immediate, but it did little to calm his nerves. His mind replayed Samuel's words over and over, each one carving deeper into the foundation of Jack's beliefs. "You're afraid of what I represent." Jack let out a low growl, slamming the flask onto the desk. The sound startled Darren, who looked up from his paper with a raised eyebrow. "You all right there, Jack?" Darren asked, his tone half teasing. "Fine," Jack snapped, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Darren shrugged and went back to reading, but Jack's frustration only grew. The cracks in his composure were widening, and for the first time he felt truly exposed. It wasn't just Samuel's defiance that gnawed at him, it was the truth in his words. Jack had always prided himself on being a man of control, a man who knew his place in the world and enforced it with an iron will. But now he wasn't so sure. The certainty he had clung to his entire life was slipping through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but questions. He thought of his father, the towering figure who had shaped Jack into the man he was. His father's voice echoed in his mind, stern and unyielding. "Don't let them win, boy. You have to show strength. Always." But what did strength mean now? Was it the ability to wield power without question, or the courage to face truths Jack had spent his life avoiding? The door to the station creaked open, breaking Jack's spiral of thought. He looked up, half expecting to see Samuel or Wallace returning for another round of accusations, but instead it was an elderly man, Reverend Henry, a black preacher from the local church. His presence was calm but firm, his eyes filled with an unspoken understanding that immediately put Jack on edge. "What do you want?" Reverend Jack asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Henry stepped inside, his hands clasped in front of him. "I came to talk, Officer Holloway." Jack scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Not sure I'm in the mood for a sermon tonight." Henry smiled faintly. "I'm not here to preach. I'm here because I think you need to hear something." Jack narrowed his eyes. "And what makes you think I'd care to hear anything you have to say?" Henry's expression didn't falter. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Jack, his movements slow and deliberate. "Because I've seen men like you before, Jack. Men who carry the weight of hate not because they want to, but because they don't know how to let it go." Jack's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Henry's words felt too close to the truth, and Jack wasn't ready to confront it. "I saw what happened tonight," Henry continued, his voice gentle but firm. "You think you were in control of that situation, but you weren't. Samuel Wright saw through you, and I think that scared you." Jack leaned forward, his fists clenched on the desk. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Henry asked, his gaze unwavering. "You've spent your life building walls around yourself, Jack. Walls built by your father, by this town, by the lies you've been told about who's worth respecting and who isn't. But Samuel didn't fit into those lies, did he? He forced you to see something different." Jack's chest tightened, the weight of Henry's words pressing down on him. He wanted to argue, to push back, but he couldn't, because deep down he knew Henry was right. "What do you want from me?" Jack asked, his voice low and strained. "I don't want anything from you," Henry said. "But you have a choice to make, Jack. You can keep holding on to the lies, or you can let them go and see the truth for what it is. It won't be easy, but it'll be worth it." Jack stared at Henry, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. For the first time, he felt the full weight of the life he had lived, the beliefs he had clung to, and the damage they had caused. And for the first time, he wondered if he had the strength to change. Henry stood, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "The choice is yours, Jack. But remember this, no one is born with hate in their heart. It's something we learn, and if we can learn it, we can unlearn it too." With that, Henry turned and walked out of the station, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint buzz of the lights above. Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the empty door. For the first time in his life, Jack Holloway felt truly lost. The station felt emptier after Reverend Henry left, though Jack Holloway sat in the same chair, in the same room. The preacher's words lingered like a thick fog, clouding Jack's mind and tugging at the edges of his thoughts. "You have a choice to make." Jack clenched his fists on the desk, the calluses on his hands a reminder of the hard life he had built for himself. He wasn't a man given to introspection. Doubt was weakness, and weakness had no place in the world his father had taught him to navigate. Yet here he was, staring into the abyss of his own beliefs, unsure of where solid ground lay. Outside the station, the night was quiet, save for the distant hum of cicadas. The town slept, unaware of the storm raging within Jack's mind. The station's phone rang sharply, cutting through the silence like a knife. Jack didn't move to answer it. Darren, from across the room, rolled his eyes and picked it up. "Yeah, Mason's Hollow PD," Darren said, his tone bored. "What's this about?" Jack tuned him out, focusing instead on the faint echoes of Reverend Henry's voice in his head. The words felt too personal, too specific to brush off. Was Henry right? Had Jack been carrying the weight of hate not because he believed it, but because it was all he knew? The thought unsettled him. Darren's voice cut through Jack's introspection. Jack, you might want to hear this." Jack blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. He stood and crossed the room, taking the phone from Darren with a gruff, "Yeah." "This is Andrew Wallace," came the voice on the other end. Jack recognized the sharp, no-nonsense tone immediately. "I've contacted the state prosecutor regarding Mr. Wright's detainment. As expected, they're not pleased. I suggest you prepare yourself for some fallout." Jack's grip on the receiver tightened. "You can't just—" "Can't what, Officer Holloway? Hold you accountable for a clear abuse of power? I think you'll find that I can, and I will. You've got a reputation in this town, but it doesn't scare me. The world is watching now, and men like you don't get to operate in the shadows anymore." The line went dead before Jack could respond. He slammed the receiver back into its cradle, his face flushed with anger. Darren smirked from his seat, clearly enjoying Jack's discomfort. "Guess the big city folks are giving you some trouble, huh?" Darren said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Jack shot him a glare that silenced him immediately. He didn't need Darren's commentary. He needed answers to questions he wasn't even sure how to ask. He stormed out of the station, letting the cool night air wash over him. The streets of Mason's Hollow were empty, the quiet broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind. Jack lit a cigarette with shaking hands, inhaling deeply and exhaling a plume of smoke into the darkness. The truth was, Jack didn't know what to do. The world he had built for himself was crumbling, and Samuel Wright was at the center of it. Jack had thought himself invincible, untouchable, but tonight had shown him otherwise. The sound of footsteps on gravel pulled Jack from his thoughts. He turned to see Reverend Henry approaching, his figure illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. "You again," Jack muttered, taking another drag from his cigarette. "Didn't you say enough back at the station?" Henry stopped a few feet away, his expression calm but resolute. "I came back because I see a man at a crossroads. I thought you might need some guidance." Jack let out a bitter laugh. "Guidance? From you? I think I'll pass." Henry didn't flinch. "You're angry, Jack. I understand that. Change is hard. It's uncomfortable. But staying the same, that's a different kind of pain, one that eats away at you over time." Jack shook his head, tossing the cigarette to the ground and grinding it out with his boot. "You don't know me." "Maybe not," Henry said. "But I know men like you. Men who've spent their lives clinging to hate because it's easier than facing the truth." Jack's fists clenched at his sides. "And what truth is that?" "That hate doesn't make you strong," Henry said. "It makes you weak. It blinds you to what's real, to what's possible. Samuel Wright isn't your enemy, Jack. He's a man, just like you. And if you'd stop fighting him for a moment, you might see that." Jack turned away, staring out at the empty street. "You think it's that simple? Just stop? Walk away from everything I've ever known?" "No," Henry said. "It's not simple. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. But it's the only thing worth doing." Jack didn't respond. He stood there, the weight of Henry's words pressing down on him like a physical force. He thought of his father, of the men in the clan who had shaped his life. They had taught him to see the world in black and white, to believe in a hierarchy that placed him above men like Samuel Wright. But tonight, for the first time, Jack saw the cracks in that foundation. He saw the lies for what they were. He turned back to Henry, his voice low and strained. If I let it go, what's left? Everything Henry said, his gaze steady. A chance to be free. A chance to be better. Jack nodded slowly, the tension in his chest easing just slightly. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he was willing to find out. The next morning, Jack sat in his patrol car, parked on the outskirts of Mason's Hollow. He had spent the night wrestling with his demons, but now he felt a strange sense of clarity. The badge on his chest felt heavier than usual, as if it carried the weight of his choices. In the distance, he saw a familiar figure walking along the road, Samuel Wright, his briefcase in hand. Jack stepped out of the car and approached him, his boots crunching on the gravel. Samuel stopped, turning to face him. His expression was calm but guarded. "Officer Holloway." Jack nodded, his throat tight. "Mr. Wright." There was a long pause before Jack spoke again. I wanted to apologize. For last night. For everything." Samuel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "I wasn't expecting that." Jack swallowed hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to say it." Samuel studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. "It's a start." Jack hesitated, then shook Samuel's hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. As Samuel walked away, Jack stood there, watching him go. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Jack was willing to take the first step.